Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly est aussi éditeur d'une revue qui est une des revues de référence en termes de Border Studies, en matière d'études sur les frontières, qui est le Journal of Borderlands Studies. Et il est secrétaire exécutif et trésorier, ce qui peut intéresser les douanes, et trésorier de l'association Association for Borderlands Studies, l'association pour les études des frontières. Voilà. Alors, Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly, on a une coopération avec lui depuis longtemps maintenant, notamment parce qu'à travers le projet Borders in Globalization, alors ça, ce n'était pas dans la biographie que vous avez sur vos tables, mais je vous invite très vivement à consulter sur Internet le site de ce projet, Borders in Globalization, donc BIG, parce que vous y trouverez des informations très intéressantes. C'est un projet pluridisciplinaire. Je pense que tu pourras le présenter éventuellement, mais dire juste quelques mots. C'est un projet pluridisciplinaire qui s'intéresse aux flux de personnes, aux flux de marchandises, à la dimension culturelle, historique. Donc c'est une vision holistique des frontières et c'est extrêmement intéressant et riche. Voilà. Je ne vais pas m'attarder. Je vais laisser la parole à Emmanuel pour une conférence d'une quarantaine de minutes qui sera suivie par des questions. Merci.
Bonjour à tous. Je vais parler français pour commencer, puis anglais ensuite pour la présentation à la canadienne. Je voudrais vous dire que c'est un honneur de pouvoir présenter Borders in Globalization à cette conférence. C'est un honneur, je pense, que je dois au secrétaire général de l'Organisation mondiale des douanes et à M. Quentin, le secrétaire général de l'Organisation des douanes, Cunio Mikuria. Merci beaucoup de m'avoir invité. Je le dois aussi certainement au directeur général des douanes de Tunisie, M. Ben Hassan. Nous avons 4 collègues qui sont dans la salle, qui ont présenté et qui vont présenter des travaux sur la sécurité. Mais aujourd'hui, à l'occasion de ma présentation, je vais en fait vous parler de tout le projet, ou en tout cas de certaines parties du projet qui me paraissent particulièrement intéressantes pour les douanes. Et puis j'essaye d'avoir des conclusions de manière à provoquer un petit peu les questions, mais aussi provoquer un petit peu la pensée en politique publique sur les douanes. Alors je ne sais pas où je pointe pour ça. Comme j'ai 40 diapositives, si je ne peux pas les faire passer moi-même, ça va être très difficile de parler. Il faut absolument que ce système marche. Là, je suis désolé, mais... Ah, parfait. Donc, le projet Borders in Globalization is now in its 4th year, and it's a very large research program. It's working. It's good. That has teams in many different countries. I have 63 researchers and professors that are involved, and we have over 120 graduate students in those different countries. And I'll detail this in a few minutes, but the whole idea in this research program, is to engage with public policy. Hence the great honor that the World Customs Organization is doing us when it accepts that we come and present our work here. What we're faced with, and I will detail a little bit today, is basically a fundamental transformation in the way we understand territories, states, and how states work and work through all of the policies that implement, the role of boundaries, borders, borderland in that work, and the fact that international trade, so-called, the globalization of trade, is disrupting all of this. So what I call here a fundamental change in logics from understanding state and territories, which all of us understand very well in our imaginaries and in our knowledge base, to understanding how flows and connectivity is changing all of this. And obviously, the information communication revolution is having an impact on all of this, but it's only one of the factors. It's not a determining factor. So the goal of these studies, many different studies, we have well over 120 studies that are undertaken, is to look, as Monsieur Quentin, Dr. Quentin just said, at different factors such as governance and changes in border governance, changes in economic and human flows, the history, the culture of borderlands, and the impact that security agenda and sustainability agendas, climate change, have on the bordering process that states have tried to implement now for hundreds of years. I'm going to go through those slides, but I've put them in here. If you have any interest in the project and want the PowerPoints, you can see them. You have here a description of all the countries that are involved. You can see that in the Maghreb, we've started a project in Morocco, and we'll hold a summer school there in this next summer. So what are we discussing here? For this presentation, I've elected to review 45 of the studies that are in the works today in this project, and I've organized them according to a number of themes. The first one is the end of the territory. It's kind of it's an academic way of asking how states are transformed and how borders are transforming states and bordering processes are transforming states. Understanding the connectivity challenge, flows of trades that are obviously primarily one of your concerns, the security challenge, and then the challenge of fundamental change from governing this to having governance systems that allow us to actually adapt and work throughout. And what impact does this have for customs? So when we look at the end of territory question, or basically how states have evolved, are evolving currently and have evolved since, I would say, the 1970s, have become aware of this transformation. What we have here is something that my colleague Christian Leprech alluded to yesterday, is the idea that we understand states as if they were castles. There are reasons for this. Thank you. I'm summarizing about 15 studies for this, and I'll go through them very quickly. So these castles means that we understand borders as if they were walls. They are boundary lines that circumvent and board, basically, the castle, right? What happens once the borders are perforated by flows? So let me take you back to the history of this understanding of space and territories that we have today. It's quite interesting, I think, to look back a little bit in history to basically realize that our understanding of territory obviously has moved across history. And hence those two citations here. One by Jared Diamond that reminds us of the fact that our understanding of the boundary line, the traditional custom path along the boundaries to catch smugglers, is actually a fairly recent understanding and relationship that humans have with territory. For the longest time, we saw these are spaces. The idea that we didn't know exactly where the boundary line was. And I want to come back to this. And then also the idea that states, on average, have a life, or empires have a lifetime that is about 2 human generations, between 50 and 70 years for most of them. So we are in a period of time today that is very interesting because we are actually not aware of the fact that we have more and more states, more and more borders across the world. And I want to come back to this because it does have an impact also in the way we work. So this is just an illustration. You have a picture here in black and white of Uruk, which is one of the first human cities ever built. And it is where we invented walls as a way to protect the wealth of the city from the peripheries. But you also have a certain number of others walls, and you have, for instance, the Hadrian Wall in the grass, and you have the China Wall as well that came later. So we fenced ourselves for the longest time. We started by creating cities, and then we understood that there was here reasons. We started fencing ourselves, and we started wanting to protect certain lands. as soon as we stopped being mobile, when human societies became sedentary, they started wanting to come back a season at a time, to come back to harvest the land. And so between the 8,000 years ago and about 4,000 years ago, there is a progressive understanding in the human mind that we have to circumvent, we have to border, if you want, territory. And we have to have agreements with other groups so that it works. The first technology that we have to do this in the history of humanity is international agreement, or a law. An agreement between two cities in this case, right? The Stela of Vulture is about almost 4,000 years old. And it is the first time in the history of humanity that we use the law to define, to describe, to ensure that we have agreements that a certain space is not going to be crossed. So the first technology that we use, and is still with us, with regard to imposing borderlands and or boundary lines, comes with this. Our understanding of states and the role of states is grounded in this stela. And it's also grounded in that technology, the rule of law. I think it's very important to be reminded of this, because it means that obviously we, as a human collectivity, we understand space in relationship to that first technology, but we also understand space in relationship to that first understanding of the boundary line. Things are not so clear up front because obviously for hundreds of years we have very approximate maps. We look at the skies and we tend to forget this. But obviously to be able to have a boundary line, we need to be very accurate in the way we draw our maps. And our maps, until the Harrison clock, are very, very approximate. But the generalization of the rule of law comes with the modern state and the Treaty of Westphalia, which in the modern period really establishes the fact that a multitude of powers and kingdoms agree that the rule of law will allow them to become friends, even though they were enemies before that. So the Harrison clock is a major technological advance. And what it allows us to do, it allows us to change the nature of the treaties in the modern period from having to describe where the boundary line runs along the geographies of our different territories to actually being able to use map as references. Because for the first time, we have both the longitude and the latitude. Note that it's not a long time ago. It's fairly recent that the idea of the boundary line and maps used as references in treaties are really effective. The transformation that we have here is an important transformation because it means that our understanding of boundary lines is fairly recent in the history of humanity, but the usage of the rule of law has a few hundreds of years. The Treaty of Paris and the period of colonization are the periods during which this way of thinking has been generalized across the world. We now have treaties that make references to maps, and we have treaties that are fairly specific and do not have to describe, basically, the custom path or trail across the borderland. We have boundary lines in maps, and we know exactly where we stand. Now, there are a few transformations here that are very interesting, and one of them is that during the negotiation of the Treaty of Paris at the end of the First World War, decision makers, in a way, ignore the idea of self-determination and laugh at it. But since the Second World War, it's something, in a way, that has come back with a revenge. And let me illustrate this. What we can see when we look at state formation today is that since the Second World War, the number of states has almost increased every single year. So we've moved from about 50, 60 states or powers that were recognized by the international community to almost 200. And this is going on. Borderlands are the most violent areas in the world. Borderlands and border disputes, not just positional disputes as to where the boundary line is, but the borderlands disputes, the borders that straddle international boundaries, are actually very often areas of disputes, conflicts, and so on and so forth. So what I would like to draw from this, which I think is a very important part, is that over the centuries, we have built the castle. We have developed an imaginary and a science and a knowledge and references to an understanding of states where the boundary line is finite and organizes the territory in a way, in a fixed manner. It sets up the territory like a castle and its walls. And yet, what we have is the evidence that castles are subdividing. And also that castles, when they don't want to subdivide, see Spain today with Catalonia, which is all over the media in this part of the world. But there are many different examples. The last time I looked at the number of areas that were in disputes, the CIA had 120 references across the world. We also have castles who delegate powers as a way to mitigate tensions between the center and periphery, but also between communities and issues of self-determination. Obviously, boundaries and borders are the best way to analyze these changes. But one of the lessons that we have here, however, which is very interesting and very important, is that the castle walls are not exactly the best way to understand borders, because they're being disrupted from inside, top down, and bottom up. So there are two ways to understand that disruption, and there are two ways to understand, in a way, the period of history in which we are positioned today. And we look at here the technological challenge, connectivity challenge, and the security challenges. How do we analyze the connectivity challenge? We basically look at regulatory systems. We look at specific markets, and we look at how these markets, in a way, are bounded by law. Whether they're self-regulatory. If they self-regulate, it's very interesting to realize that certain markets self-regulate. They straddle over a boundary or many boundaries. They may straddle even across many states. In other words, our traditional castle understanding of the boundary line would be completely overridden, taken over, perforated by the regulatory system. The tension here, therefore, is to understand, for instance, or the next step is to understand, how do we secure those flows that are self-regulated? So let me illustrate this a little bit. I've used 15 of our studies to describe this, and I did discuss this a little bit last year at this conference in a paper. We have had studies on different areas of trade, for instance, oil, but also gas, coal, what do I do wrong? Water, and so on and so forth. Specific industries like processed food, agricultural product, meat production, and transportation networks. And here is, in a way, what we find. When we look at the specific case of Alberta, which is one of the large Canadian provinces across the Rockies, and we look at specifically the oil sands, that everybody knows the oil sands, we realize that all of its suppliers are located about 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers away for 70 to 90% of the supplies. In other words, the Canadian-US border is irrelevant to the oil sands. The trade is regulated by the flow of trade itself and the number of suppliers across a big agreement, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement. Now, if we look down, and if we look outside of the oil sand, but we look, for instance, at a number of areas of trade that Canada has, what we see is that the Canada-US boundary line sometimes is quite effective. In other words, the idea of self-regulated markets is not always present across all markets. I think this is an interesting finding for customs, because it means you would have to know about this to be able to exercise, to implement your policies really effectively. But this is closest to what customs have done for the longest time. And so I just mentioned some of them. If we look at transportation system, if we look at trade investments, if we look at labor markets, and so on and so forth, we see some coordination, some issues straddle the two constituencies, the US and Canada, but not all. Transportation, interestingly, is one that is actually really regulated top-down. In other words, provinces and localities have a huge impact. But if we look at other areas, it's quite interesting to see that, for instance, in the electricity market, or even better, if we look at meat trade being produced in Canada for the Japanese and South Korean markets, for instance, we could almost say that the regulatory system established in Japan and Korea has created what some of my students called a regulatory border bubble. The Japanese regulatory system is fully implemented into the production plant for the meat. And we find this in a number of sectors. In other words, where is Canada? But for territory. Obviously, the boundary here has been completely perforated, and the regulatory role of the border is almost irrelevant in this case. But what is really interesting in this case is that we're faced, in a way, by a viable geometry. We have regulatory systems of all kinds, depending on the sectors and the industries that we're dealing with, that reinvent the borders. They reinvent the bordering processes according to their own needs. How do customs adapt to this? So in summary, what we can say that all those flows break the walls. They obviously also create a huge conundrum for our own way of thinking. The boundary line becomes questionable. We have issues here. It's difficult to know how do we basically control those flows because of this variable geometry. But it's also important to understand how do we secure them? How do we make sure that those flows are not ways for illicit activities, for instance? One of my colleagues used to say, if I have to bring anything into Canada, I'll use the container system, so I'm going to do research on this. He's presenting some of his research this afternoon. Todd Hattale. So we have very different logics. So the security conundrum, obviously, is very important here. And the questions that we ask is, how do we create those new walls? How do we secure those flows? This is a huge dilemma. This is extremely complex, and we have a number of studies that I'm trying to summarize here for your benefit, which I think give us some ideas. One thing that we know for sure is that securing the border with a wall is only a partial answer. You cannot encourage flow of trades, even if you specialize port of entry. Some port of entry for certain goods, other ports of entry for humans, or certain kinds of humans, and so on and so forth. Even if you specialize the territorial port of entry into your territory, even if it's super sophisticated, the variable geometry that you face is so complex that you are not able to deal with this. You need to find some ways that are general principles. They're going to apply across all of these questions. Hence the question that I raise here. Where is and what is the new castle? So I used 15 studies to summarize this, and I use some examples here. Most of the work that we do in security has been led by Christian Leprecht, who might be in the room, and who talked to you yesterday, about his relationship and relations analysis of illicit networks across basically the whole Saharan region. When we look at networks, most of the research focuses on what is the weak link. And it is a very good question, because we want to understand the weakest link in the illicit network. So we have studies, for instance, on cybersecurity. We have studies on the organization of illicit network like the Hezbollah. We have studies on gun trafficking. All of those have been actually directed by Christian. We have studies on maritime boundary and how do we organize security in vast maritime regions, for instance, on the Atlantic coast of Canada, with the US, with the Arctic, with Europe on the other side and Russia on the other side, and so on and so forth. And the one common theme, which I think is a very important finding, is that all of those systems do focus on the weak link. But you know what the weak link is? It always has to do with breaking through a network of trust. It always has to do with a governance system that is based on trusted information. So the weak link is basically identified when you understand where the cluster is. This is why in cybersecurity, for instance, we have tried to create walls, and we realize that it doesn't work. You know, all of us buy even protective walls at times. We have little machines that will prevent certain viruses to come into our computer. But really what is fundamental is to understand how we can implement policies that would generalize this ability to systematically implement trusted information systems. I will pass on this, and I will just summarize. When we look at connectivity and security and the technology that we have, the role of technology is important, but I would not go as far as to say if we have the best computers, we're safe. Human resources remain the most important aspect here. And I would say the factors that are absolutely decisive have to do with trust and mechanisms to process information transparency. Very often, it has to do with the ability to verify the kind of information given into the network so that the information will overlap with each other and create a coherent whole. Hence the usage of algorithms, for instance, that allow you to go to the information you want through a diversity of ports of entry. So the new walls, in my mind today, are made up of trusted information. It is loose, like the networks that we're dealing with, but it is very important to become aware of this because then it will influence all of the policy decisions that we put in place. The boundary line is made up of trusted information in a world of flows. Does this mean that we should ignore the boundary line? Obviously not. It superimposes itself. It's exactly like a new layer of sedimentation or a new layer of complexity. We need to work with both today, and they are complementary. They don't oppose each other. So this is the challenge that we're faced with today. From government to governance. And I have to say, in my comments about custom, this is something that I will discuss a little bit more. I think that governments worldwide have obviously adapted somewhat. And so the Borders in Globalization Research Program has many studies which I direct directly. I look at them very carefully across all of the different areas. I looked at them in the area of culture, sustainability, security, and flows. I read all of them. We have specialized studies that just look at that transformation from government to governance. What is governance? What form does it take? What is the best possible governance for the best possible security system or secured system? How do we do this effectively? When I summarize some of the studies here, we look at sustainability issues, we look at immigration issues, we look at flow of trades. What do we notice? We notice that in every single case, we haven't found one instance where a single government was able to control, was able to master, was able to impose its own will effectively. In every single case, however, it is also very interesting to realize the forms of governance that are implemented adapt with the very questions at stake. You do not manage certain flow of trades the same way that you manage other flows of trades. You do not manage sustainability, for instance, water flow changes across international boundaries. Two of the examples that come to mind is the Yukon River and the Yukon watershed in northern Canada, which goes all the way into Alaska. It's about a space as big as the whole of Spain. Or the Fraser Valley that overlaps the Cascade Mountains between Vancouver and Seattle. You know that these watersheds are actually shrinking today? They're having huge impact on all the populations at the periphery of the watersheds. So the governance systems that we are renegotiated in the case of the Fraser Valley has a huge impact on the International Joint Commission agreement that Canada and the US have for clear water, but also for fisheries, and is impacting all of the communities there. So the actors, the public sector, the private sector, the non-profit sector, indigenous communities, all of them have a stake in this matter. It's the same when we look at traders. It's the same when we look across industries. So the castle walls are broken. The challenge is the 21st century connectivity. It changes the way, and this is in part because of information communication and increase in global trade. Right? Information communication will not go away. And it changes the way we do trade. And this development across the world of specific regulatory systems that are not always in the hands of the public sectors. They're not always in the hands of specific states. They're very often in the hands of the private sectors. They're in the hands of many different types of actors very often, across sectors, public, private, non-profit, and so on and so forth. So the reality of government points to good governance, whereby government work with complex multi-actor partnership to manage very good policy. What's important here is to realize that the good governance has to be tailor-made. There is no other word for this. In every single area, you have to identify who are the key actors. And because you have limited resources, you should always start with the ones where you actually can find some return on investments. In the case of custom, for instance, is where is it? Who pays the most duty in a given country? What are the 20 top traders that pay the most duty, that bring in and out goods, and that you want to tax first? Who are the top 50, the top 100, the top 1,000, the top 10,000? Rank them and work with them. Each area will have its own regulatory system. Some of them will be traditional. You will control the boundary line extremely well, as you have always done. In other cases, it's way more complex. Think about, for instance, what Morocco does today with agricultural product and their ability to sell all over Europe, as if they were part of the common agricultural policy. That's part of the special status Morocco negotiated. It changes the nature of the relationship. It changes the nature of the regulatory environment. It has simplified customs as well. But think about smaller sectors, for instance, trading phosphates across the rest of the world. So lessons for customs. Scale have changed, and changing territories. In a way, some people like to think of territories as flexible or elastic. You know, it's the whole social science discussions that we have on the impact of transportations. When you have rapid ways across a territory, it shrinks it because it takes less time for a good to go from A to B across 1,000 kilometers. If you have access to a fast train, for instance, or a plane, you can cross the whole of Europe in an hour and a half. In Canada, for the same distance, it would take 3 or 4 hours, sometimes 5, 6 even. But that's not just the point I'm trying to make. It's not just transportation and speed of transportation and the elasticity of territory. It is the fact that it's fundamentally being disturbed. And that understanding of the castle obviously needs to take into account the fact that the walls have disappeared or are, in a way, just a part of a complex policy system. What is the new scale? The new scale is from the local to the regional, to the national, the state level, to the supra-regional, to the world. So when we think policy, we need to think across those different scales. And obviously, what's behind this elasticity has to do with these new regulatory systems. And the way we approach the policies that have to do with collecting resources from them. They come in and out of a territory. They come in and out even of a bubble, a border bubble, as some of my students like to say. Do I collect? If I have a special investment zone, for instance, in Niagara region, where I bring in and out goods, what do I do with them? Are they completely tax-free? How do I work with them? What is the scale with which I work? It can be the rest of the world. It can be just North America. It can just be between Canada and the US. So although these networks are rooted in territories, what is important here is that they undermine our castle mentality. We need to think outside the box. And the reason we need to think outside the box is both the elasticity, the transformation of our understanding of territory, and the role of boundary lines, which has thousands of years. Today, we need to look at the new walls. The new way of implementing security is with trusted information. In a minute, I'm going to illustrate how customs around the world have started doing this. But I just want to show you that this is the way to go. It's not going to disappear. This is with you for the next 2 generations. And then one of the things that I think is not done enough in the world of custom is the issue of governance and the understanding that you cannot manage this complexity if you do not adapt bureaucracies, human resources, and technology to actually partner with other departments across governments, sometime with other governments, and sometime also with the private sector, your number one client, traders. So my conclusions last year were customs should do less at the boundary line. It's a relationship of resources. You should still do things at the boundary line. And maybe you still need to have staff going around, as I like to say, the custom trail around the boundary line to stop smugglers. I come from a family of smugglers. We were Franco-Italians. We lived in the high valleys of the Alps. The village I come from is at 2,500 meters above sea level. It's about 5 kilometers away from the current Italian boundary. To this day, that village hosts people who, in Europe, are illegal migrants. To this day. This is the kind of culture that village has, hosted for the longest time. No wonder I study borders. So Much less than borders. However, the new challenge is to build partnerships. Thomas Quentins yesterday talked to you a little bit about this. Christian Leprech did as well. The whole idea that partnering with others is so difficult. How do you develop a system of trusted information if you cannot engage with people, if you cannot develop procedures, if you cannot agree on algorithms? This is where the challenge is today. To do this work, you need to work across sectors. The public sector is one. For instance, in Canada, Canadian Customs have to work with the Department of Health, Agriculture, Immigration, Policing. It doesn't stop there. It starts there. So when I look at the World Bank reports on what customs do when they try to modernize, this is what I find. I find that, for instance, customs have developed new agreements, frameworks, to allow the personal management of specific accounts. It's not just the idea that you would have transit or custom warehouses where you bring your goods, you go across the boundary line, and you ship them abroad. And where there is a physical inspection, is that these traders are so important that they can do it in-house. They do it at home. They do it through an information system which is all computerized. They basically share their accounting with you. They have to. This is what we call trusted information. What is the competitive advantage for them? It takes them no time to cross the border. Why? It's part of the production process. Do you think meat plants in the middle of Saskatchewan and Manitoba who ship the meat to Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, do you think they actually ship the meat and then stop at the boundary line and wait for 24 hours? No. The custom process is in the plant. The information is trusted. This is the kind of relationship that we have to invent tomorrow. We should invent in the future. So traders are not potential smugglers. My great-grandfather was probably a smuggler. He probably knew the custom officer really well. Today, it has to be a partnership. Information has to be given voluntarily, especially if you're a very large trader. This is the new boundary. This is the new boundary that you can import and export. This is the kind of boundary that is flexible. That trust and information, that belonging that traders have into a specific regulatory system is key to their success. You become a partner to their economic success worldwide. But you can also set standards. You, on the other hand, you know that you have to implement clear, transparent, and here I say efficient and predictable type of measures. It's not something that we negotiate with, the ability to maybe get a cutback if you can corrupt the officer. That's not possible anymore. In a trusted information system, all has to be predictable. International standards have to apply. And they have to be put into systems. So when I look a little bit more at customs, I see the development in certain countries, a lot of countries, Morocco is a good example here as well, where the procedures are actually electronic. It simplifies a lot of things when the procedures have become electronic. There are no human relationship. Corruption is not possible, or much less likely, much more difficult. And things are standardized in such a way that obviously they have a lot of efficiencies. As I say, if you have integrated the custom process into your production line, then you save a lot of time. Thank you very much. And I'm open to questions and comments. 45 minutes? Shall I sit down?
Oui, c'est bon. Très bien. Merci beaucoup.
Very good. Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for this very rich presentation. As you put us on a trip through the history of borders. You explained the concept. You spoke to us again about the recent evolution of borders because you said it was very recent. I will not at all sum up everything you've said as it was a very rich presentation, but I have many questions for, personally, but I will give priority to the public. If there are any questions, we will take them. Otherwise, we can give you maybe some time to think about your questions, and I can start with mine. Does anyone have a specific question here for the moment? No, apparently not. So I shall start. I just wanted to. I actually seem to have. I've learned a lot of things, but one specific thing. So there were two specific points I seem to have gotten from this is the issue of local issue and trust, and these are two things that are very connected. Especially that we have to trust, especially if we're close, especially geographically close to people. And these two questions are related. There are sub-questions in there. The first one is the issue of local, is the issue of change of scale. And I'm talking here about the security dimension of this. You said that borders were places of conflict or opposition between the nations, the countries today. And with Christian yesterday, we mentioned it yesterday, and we'll continue, to conflicts are today localized, that they're not always between countries or nations, of course. This, again, calls on the issue of data. Do you think that this attention that we give currently to the local dimension of conflict, does it call on a reality, which is the reduction or decrease of risk of conflict between nations? Or is it the fact that borders are an element of conflict between the nations? Or is it, or maybe it's because we have more data and more capacity, and thus the local conflicts that were invisible become visible now and accessible to researchers? I'm asking here. So this local dimension or measure, this issue of visibility of the local conflict over the, around the borders, is my question. The second question about local aspect, and this is a transition on a question about trust. Yesterday, it's something we see here on, volatile or fragile border areas. Is there a specific measure for the way to govern? Do we govern the border in a different manner, even in larger concepts, from the rest of the territory, especially because the border, as you said, is an economic resource, but it's also a symbolic resource. You talked about this, and also because those who can regularly cross the border are also people who have a specific culture, differently from those who live outside in the rest of the territory who consider the border as a protection. We see this specifically where the desert areas of people who are, connected or linked to the desert area or the border, they have an identity. They're not always a fixed identity because people have, rotate or change, but they relate to this as a form of identity. And their identity is the freedom of crossing this border, at the difference of their other nationals who are not as free to cross the border, And so there's maybe an opposition here between the center and the peripheral area around it. So I come back to this issue of trust question, because as you said, there's always been issues of trust and questions of trust, but today we have more or less, most certainly, a change of scale here. It becomes national and then international. It's a question of trust between customs, between the states, between the administrations and the standards, and the private actors who have an international, size. The question is, who defines this trust, these criteria for trust? Because as you said too, the border changed geometry, but also changed in its density. It has become a lot less dense for many and much more permeable for others and easy to cross. But it's also become much harder for others, for many others, for many others. The border has remained and has become more or less impossible to cross the line simply because they do not go or fit into this criteria of trust. So who decides the criteria of trust here? So here we're talking about the key actors. Okay, that's great. We know who these are. It's those who cross, define, etc. But where are the people themselves in all this discussion, this conversation? So if I'm not an important tax contributor on the economy of the border, so how do I have any role in the governance of the border? So who defines these criteria for trust? Knowing that trust is a determining factor in the crossing of borders and the hardening, on the other hand, of borders or their softening. And it opens on the question of trust is acquired through the circulation of information and data that the actors exchange. The problem is that these data that are exchanged are very structured. You spoke more or less about accounting here, and those who are outside the criteria of accounting trust, as a criteria which are defined by the private sector. We did, research before together on formal and informal, and so all these people are outside of the trust criteria and the forms of trust that we talk. It's not one trust; these are different forms. What are the people who are outside of this? How do they do? How can they? Do they have any voice in the matter? That's an awful lot of questions on the issue of trust. Shall I continue in French? In French, yes. So on the question of trust, what we did, in fact, for many hundreds of years, is that we developed trust as usually illicit networks use very close relationships to go around the network. We've always known each other in these networks, so we trust each other. It's the idea of proximity. The closer we are from each other, the more we have trust in each other. But the systems that allow us to have an information that we can trust, it's very different. It's the setup and the development of procedures that allow the cross-referencing and verification more or less automatically in a certain way of this information. And this is the great difficulty we have, because it's humans that manage this, but us, inventors of public policies, as managers of public policies, we need to be aware the information society allows us to do this transfer, but it also forces us in a certain way to do so. We have the capacity to cross-reference this data. And so, in fact, I would say the new system is added on, but does not substitute the old system. This is the difficulty. For all for organizations that have limited budget, then everybody's ever said you've got a new problem, so we're going to double your budget. You just get told you have the same budget. We want you to build walls. We want you to have doors. But we also want you to certify certain companies so that they can go across a border, in a jiff, without. But we don't give you a budget to do this. Yeah, you have to do it because it's with these people that you will be able to put in place these relationships in a certain way, and full trust relationships. It does not mean that there are no controls, but at least it allows you to limit your controls to what you call your clients. I think that this awareness of this transformation at the level of human resources mostly is very, very important, because it allows us to streamline what's happening today. So how do I manage my global border? I manage it by putting in place policies which are, in fact, built on trust relations, sophisticated relationships which are written into procedures that are into computer systems. And this allows us to then streamline how we continue to do the work we've been doing for about 250 years. We continue to do the path or the route of the border. We continue to identify those who make bundles of clothes, such as in Tijuana, or El Paso, or Juarez, where the smugglers of bundles of clothes between Tijuana and Juarez, or Paso and Juarez, do it through, prepared vehicles. We did works that after 9/11, on 3 weeks, the traffic of bundles had started again, despite the hardening of the border. So it's important to not substitute this, but we must be aware that it's a new layer being added. What I suggest here is that the future is anyways, and the evolution of systems of public policies in the field of borders and the treatment of migrant populations and migrant flows is going to go more and more towards where we think the border, conceive the border as a need. I'm going to use a horrible word for this, but we're going to frontierize, borderize the flows. We organize the global border by imposing to the people our definition of a global border. So now I come to, we do not know these people. How do we create this relation? Somehow of, of some form of trust. And this is the problem of governance. You cannot impose in the same way the rules of government, traditional, conventional rules of government, hierarchized to global networks for many reasons. One of which being is that there's very powerful networks on the economic level which can move their markets elsewhere. But on the other hand, you can work with them. That's the idea that I was talking to you about earlier through my second point in my presentations, when I was talking about complex regulation systems where governance around each regulation system is and somehow adjusted, adapted to the system itself. And so you have a very, very big trader who sells phosphate all around the world. You work with them to determine what is the necessary information for it to be a trusted information. Once that's done, once you do this, unless there's a fundamental transformation in the way they carry out or their flow of exchanges, it can be put in place into a computer system and can only be controlled every so often. You no longer need to have permanent tracking or follow-up. So in my opinion, this is the link between the local and the conventional relation, ethnic or religious family, which we see in many illicit networks of, acquaintances or people you know, and the new processes that actually create systems, procedures to develop trust and trusted information. The generalization of these procedures as an idea in public policies is very important, but the idea that comes straight after that is that we need to adapt this to each trade system or regime, or flow of trade, okay, to each flow of trade, yes, because the scales are different, the actors are different. And this implies a new form, a new profession, shall we say, for customs. As I said, it's starting to be set up and being implemented. There are many countries that are starting to work on this. I'm not sure if people are aware that clustered information or trusted information, seriously, is the final objective of the policy. This is the new border. It's tomorrow's border. So if you have people who are refusing to communicate information that are outside the the circle of trust, this system, this way of thinking of the tomorrow's border is going to have a lot of influence, especially on, on all the security system, the granting of visas. Passports are nearly bygone. But the deliverance of the issuance of visas is more or less based on this. If we can trust you, it allows us to make a relationship very individual with a company or the global company or a person, or even with an individual actor, a person that would have the right to go in and out of many countries and many fields. You know, in North America, for example, you have these security cards, what we call nexus cards, that allow you to cross the border between the U.S. and Canada just by going through a gate or door. And it's a scanner, a retinal scanner, basically, and it leads your biometric data, and it goes in a few seconds. You know, this generation is based, in fact, on these trust algorithms, and so we still do it in the conventional way. Yes, we have interviews, we check the information. Tomorrow, we'll have systems, and we already have them that work into a certain way. You know, Benjamin said that there's limits to biometrics. There are ideals. We have to be very careful. But this is the path that we're seeing being developed very slowly. But conceptually, even if we can never have full trust in these technologies, and I am one of these people that does not trust this technology. I think that it's human resources that are key. But as a concept, trusted information remains the same. It is tomorrow's border. It's the new challenge. And as I was saying in my presentation, I think that the key for the development of the trusted systems of trusted information happens around the setup of governance systems of partnerships that define together the procedures. Unless there is one more question or last question, I think that we can close. It is now nearly 10:15. Thank you. I would like you to salute one last time Professor Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly. Thank you. Thank you, Emmanuel. I will just give you some practical information before the break. So amongst